with PFAS coming from so many different sources, it's just hard for me to imagine a scenario where FDA would find enough evidence to somehow require a recall of products or take some kind of action for PFAS in cosmetics.
Hello, welcome to FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the only independent national forum, the only podcast dedicated to discussing the latest developments at FDA. I want to remind you, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so very, very easily. You go to fdawatch.net. That's fdawatch.net. You put in your email address. You push submit, and it's free. And from now on, you will get emails whenever we issue a podcast. We're doing about one a week these days, or when there's breaking news. Plus, you'll have easy access to our headlines. We have an ongoing series right now on medical devices, working with the law firm Covington on that. So if you have a particular interest in medical devices, that's one to listen to. And we just had a very good one on foods as well. Today, we're going to be talking about cosmetics. We have two great guests, and I will introduce them in a minute. Let me first get to some headlines from the Pharma desk. PreCheck pilot program. This is a program that aims to strengthen domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. It's a voluntary program. The FDA is now accepting applications to the program. Those 7 companies that are accepted will get good advice from FDA as they are developing their facilities. The goal is to return pharmaceutical manufacturing to the U.S. And again, the applications are being accepted until the end of February. From the device desk, STAT reported that 2 key leaders in FDA's digital health and device oversight staff are leaving the agency. Jessica Paulson, who was acting deputy director of the Digital Health Center of Excellence, David McMullen, director of the Office of Neurological and Physical Medical Devices, both leaving the agency. Both were involved in shaping policy on digital health products and AI-related regulation amid ongoing challenges, new regulatory initiatives. Their departures come at a particularly sensitive time because FDA is now navigating evolving priorities for digital and software-enabled medical technologies. So we'll see who replaces them, but 2 important departures. This is part of what I would call a brain drain. In a recent medical devices episode, one of our guests discussed the fact that an ongoing brain drain in the medical devices area, and this is just emblematic of that. Foods desk. FDA has finalized a policy that limits when food products can say no artificial colors. The claim can be made only for colors that are exempt from certification. The updated approach is designed to align the public in terms of labeling with the reality of the marketplace. We recently talked about food dyes and labeling with David Linares and Dr. Susan Main in our food episode, and I encourage you to check out their thoughts. Again, the episode is available on our website, fdawatch.net. And from the cosmetics desk, Virginia lawmakers have introduced a bill called the Humane and Toxic-Free Cosmetics Act. It would ban certain ingredients, certain chemicals from cosmetics. It's designed, obviously, to reduce consumer exposure to some substances that are found in certain cosmetics products. We'll keep an eye on this, and we'll ask our guests today about the legislation like this. So with that, let's meet our guests. First up is Rend Al-Mondhiry. She is co-chair of the Regulatory Practice Group at Amin Wasserman Gurnani. She advises the dietary supplement, food, cosmetics, and over-the-counter medicines industries on a broad range of regulatory and compliance matters. She previously served as Associate General Counsel at the Council for Responsible Nutrition. Welcome to FDA Watch, Rend.
Thanks for the intro, and it's great to be here, Wayne. Appreciate it.
We do have one returning guest, Will Woodlee. Will is managing partner at the DC law firm of Kleinfeld, Kaplan, and Becker. I was honored to actually know all three of those partners, Kleinfeld, Allen, Kaplan, and Becker. Will has a broad practice in the food, drug, and cosmetics field. He joined the show about a year ago for our very first episode on cosmetics, so we're pleased to welcome you back. Welcome back, Will.
Thank you, Wayne. Really appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
So let's get started with FDA's recent report on PFAS. FDA issued a report. It was called Report on the Use of PFAS in Cosmetic Products and Associated Risks. I want to start out with Rend. What does the report signal about the agency's understanding of forever chemicals in cosmetics and personal care products? Rend, let me start with you there.
Thanks, Wayne. I think it's really a response to growing consumer interest and concerns that consumers have about PFAS in the environment, like water, in packaging, in products. So I think it's really FDA responding to those concerns. I mean, we're seeing PFAS, these forever chemicals, being reported on in the news. There's a lot of states that are passing legislation to restrict, in particular, intentionally added PFAS in a broad range of products, including cosmetics and personal care products, as well as food and a range of other consumer products. So I see this as a way for FDA to respond to those concerns and acknowledging the growing public interest in PFAS.
Will?
I agree with Rend. I think this was a requirement, if I'm not incorrect, in MoCRA for the agency to conduct this assessment. And this is an example of where the agency has delivered on what Congress required. If you look at the results from a high level, the agency found insufficient safety information regarding the bulk of the 25 ingredients used in cosmetics assessed, and low safety concern for 5 others, and only a potential safety concern regarding one at the highest concentration used in body lotion. So it's not bad news, and it's certainly responsive in a scientific way to a lot of the concerns that we've seen that have caused in the proliferation of state level legislation that may or may not in a given case have the same scientific rigor underlying the restrictions or requirements that these states have imposed related to these classes of compounds.
Yeah, we see a lot of news stories about PFAS. I'll start with Rend. What are you advising your clients to do? Is this a big issue for people in the cosmetics and personal care products industry?
So I would say it's a pretty significant issue all around, not just for cosmetics, but also in food packaging. So a lot of the risk tied to PFAS being present in products it's been mainly, despite state regulation of PFAS, has been class action risk. So, what we're seeing, especially over the past few years, are class action demand letters and lawsuits going after a range of products, including cosmetics, where there are claims about the quality or the safety of the product, or claims like clean and pure and natural, where plaintiffs are arguing that the presence of PFAS makes claims like that deceptive. So what some clients are doing is, they're kind of proactively testing their products to understand what level of PFAS might be in the products. Where is it coming from? Is it the packaging? Is it something in the product itself? To understand, what levels might exist, but it can be hard to really track down where it's coming from sometimes, because it can also be environmental But at least if you test your packaging, if you test the contents of your product, you can at least get a sense of what levels exist in the product.
Right. And Will, same question for you with regard to your clients. Is this a big issue for your clients?
Oh, it's a huge issue across CPG companies generally, not just cosmetic and personal care product companies, for all the reasons Rend mentioned, either the class action demand letter or actual lawsuit risk, dealing with state regulators, as well as dealing with other supply chain partners who may proactively impose restrictions on carrying products that include either in the products that are consumed themselves or the packaging, these types of chemicals. So whether they like it or not, whether it makes sense from a formulation or packaging material functionality standpoint, there's a movement afoot to phase out use of these ingredients, to simplify regulatory compliance matters, and to avoid potential civil liability demands.
Let me ask Rend, what do you think FDA is going to do about this? What are FDA's moves, and what's the scope of their authority to actually do something about this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So we have this congressionally mandated report. I don't recall that there was really any further direction in MoCRA. Maybe Will knows, but I don't believe that there was any sort of directive for FDA to take action, beyond publishing this report. But like Will said, I mean, it wasn't, incredibly bad news that came out of this report. So, but FDA could, I mean, if they thought that PFAS in cosmetics was somehow creating a safety risk to consumers, I mean, conceivably they could do something. Companies are required under MoCRA 2 to have safety substantiation for their products. I don't know that the PFAS was really envisioned as like, would PFAS somehow, would you need to somehow substantiate the safety of your products and account for PFAS? I don't know that that was really what that safety substantiation requirement was really targeted at. But certainly it's possible that FDA, if they did see some kind of safety signal or some growing risk or threat from PFAS, I mean, they could act on it. But I think with PFAS coming from so many different sources, it's just hard for me to imagine a scenario where FDA would find enough evidence to somehow, require a recall of products or take some kind of action for PFAS in cosmetics. But I'd be interested to hear what Will says. But I at this point, I don't see FDA doing anything with the information that they have that would somehow lead to enforcement against cosmetic products.
And so, well, let me, Rend just prompted you to answer the question, but let me add to the question. Since Congress did order this report, where does it stand in Congress? So address it from an FDA standpoint as well as a congressional standpoint.
Well, certainly the agency is subject to congressional oversight, and at a future committee or subcommittee hearing, representatives of the agency could be asked to explain what went into the report, as well as the question that you're asking, Wayne, which is the FDA going to do anything about the findings in the report with respect to products in the marketplace? I think in the current legislative climate, that seems remote, but it's a possibility, and certainly it could become more of a priority if there are additional scientific developments or adverse event developments that warrant greater attention to the issue. But I think ultimately, from FDA standpoint, they've checked the box on this piece of homework from MoCRA, and they're likely on to the next, which could be the homework related to talc or the CGMP rule, both of which have been moved to the long-term action section of the regulatory agenda.
That was a good prompt. You just mentioned talc, so let's shift gears and talk about talc. Will, can you just summarize briefly an overview of what's going on with talc? It's been in the news a long time. Of course, its relationship with asbestos. What's going on there in terms of talc with litigation and the like?
Yeah, so MoCRA required the agency to undertake rulemaking to establish testing methods for detecting and identifying asbestos in talc-containing cosmetic products. The agency originally published a proposed rule to comply with that MoCRA mandate in 2024, and then in late 2025 withdrew that proposal based ostensibly on some of the feedback received in response to the proposal in comments, to go back to the drawing board and perhaps issue a new proposed rule, which is currently in the works. So we're not exactly back at square one of following the withdrawal, but the agency's taking longer on this subject than Congress really intended, but that's for all the FDA watchers, that's I won't say par for the course, but it's not at all uncommon. And usually these deadlines for rulemaking, they either are met, they're not met, and everyone goes about their business, or usually a public interest group or other NGO sues the agency under the Administrative Procedure Act, and there's some sort of negotiated deadline beyond the original congressional deadline for in this case, rulemaking action. So not exactly holding our breaths for the next step in this process, but it is still something on the radar, and there remains litigation about alleged asbestos and alleged health impacts that resulted from exposure in talc-containing cosmetic and other products.
Yeah, I've been surprised that FDA hasn't moved more quickly, because Commissioner Carey last year identified this as one of the issues that he is focused on. So I'm surprised the agency has not taken any action. Rend, anything to add on talc?
No, I mean, I think just the issue in general of heavy metal contamination, I mean, that's been pretty pervasive across a range of consumer products. And so I think it's just important especially if you're selling powder based products to children, I think to, products intended for vulnerable populations like that, it is important for companies to test their products and understand if there is asbestos in those products, because it's another area where there could be class action risk as well. So I think with makeup products, other powdered products, they're intended for the body. It would be prudent for companies to test those products and understand what levels of asbestos or even other heavy metals might be present in those products.
Right. We're going to take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking cosmetics with Rend Al-Mondhiry of Amin Wasserman Gurnani, Will Woodlee of Kleinfeld, Kaplan, and Becker. Will, I want to start with you following this break. I mentioned in the headline section that Virginia is introducing legislation to address potentially harmful ingredients in cosmetics. What's your take on states taking legislative action, vis-a-vis the federal government? What kind of challenges does that present for FDA? We're seeing this in a lot of areas. What's your take on that?
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, we've seen a lot of this, particularly over the last year plus, under the so-called MAHA, Make America Healthy Again movement, where state legislatures, often at the urging or at least acquiescence of federal regulators, establishing specific restrictions or prohibitions or labeling requirements related to ingredients in foods as well as personal care products and cosmetics. So this is not unexpected, perhaps not welcome either from the industry, because whenever you have a patchwork of state requirements that require different packaging, different labeling, different formulations depending on the jurisdiction, it dramatically increases the operational complexity for marketing a product that, before all of this, you could conceivably market in every jurisdiction in the United States. And if these types of legislative efforts succeed, that puts even more pressure on the logistical operation of any cosmetic manufacturer who may still want to formulate with the ingredient that it can't formulate with in Virginia or Washington State or Oregon, for example. The other potential result of this, and it's not at all unexpected, would be for companies just to formulate to the most stringent national standards or state level standards for nationally marketed products. And again, that could be burdensome, costly, and ultimately reduce consumer choice depending on the ingredients and how in demand they are. And it may be for limited benefit depending on how strong the science in a given ingredient and product's case at the state level.
Right, and sometimes the state requirements are so inconsistent that adhering to one state standard might not actually meet, even if it's the strictest, might not meet other states' standards effectively with regard to labeling. Rend, what are you seeing in this area, state versus federal oversight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the influence of MAHA, as Will mentioned, has really had a profound effect on the state legislative landscape. I mean, we're seeing bills covering cosmetics as well as foods, and really entering into areas that typically have been that FDA has focused on. And really this patchwork for companies that are selling nationally, it becomes really unmanageable to have to go back and look at what each state is requiring, and the lack of having a uniform framework for labeling cosmetics. I mean, that is extremely problematic. So I think it's, and there's really very limited areas where there is express preemption under the law. And for cosmetics, to be honest, I'm not really, I know that with food labeling, there's areas where there is express preemption. But for cosmetics, there are, I would just say that preemption is pretty limited in terms of, for cosmetic labeling in general. So it is something that I think companies really need to watch out for and monitor to see what other states pass laws that are affecting cosmetics, because it's everything from the ingredients to the packaging.
Thanks, Rend. And the other thing that companies need to consider is, even if there were a strong basis to assert federal preemption in a given case with respect to a state law regulating the labeling or the formulation of cosmetic products, companies in this particular political environment will need to assess the potential blowback of challenging these state laws on this basis, because the folks opposing them can very easily in this digital world, create a narrative that adversely impacts their business and positions these companies as standing in the way of ingredient safety or clean products, and we've seen some examples over history where that an overly litigious industry gets painted in a poor light, and it ultimately affects the bottom line. So it's not just a pure legal question when it comes to how to approach potential legal challenges to these types of laws. There's also a significant public and customer relations function that has to be accounted for when assessing the ultimate decision.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that we're talking about cosmetics principally right now, but the same issues arise in all the areas that FDA regulates in different ways. The food industry, the pharmaceutical devices industry face the same issues. The most important thing that's happened in cosmetics regulation in the last few years has been MoCRA, of course, and it's changed the overall regulatory landscape for cosmetic companies, facility registration, product listing, safety substantiation, adverse event reporting. Well, let me start with you. How has the implementation of MoCRA changed the overall regulatory landscape for companies? What are your clients doing? How are they reacting to MoCRA?
I think the biggest impact has been, as with many FDA compliance initiatives, been paperwork, documentation. I think most responsible companies had very strong scientific bases regarding the safety of their products when used as directed, and very robust R&D processes to ensure that end result. But actually putting together these dossiers, working with their supply chain, it's not unlike what we saw with respect to the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard administered by the USDA, where it just created a whole new framework by which companies had to engage with either outside experts, staff up with actual internal employees to cover some of these functions, as well as engage in a more detailed scientific manner with their suppliers. So it's not been the most burdensome rollout for such an otherwise impactful amendment to the regulatory framework for this category. But if the agency were perhaps funded, to be able to enforce this more aggressively, it could spell pain, at least for some of these firms that aren't as sophisticated on these issues, and weren't doing these things on a voluntary basis before it became a legal requirement.
Right. It seems to affect certain companies differently than others, the larger manufacturers versus the smaller manufacturers. Rend, same question. MoCRA, how does it affect your clients with this change in the regulatory landscape for all cosmetics companies and personal care products companies?
Yeah, I think it's been there's been a learning curve for companies having gone for so many years without really robust, substantial changes to the law. So, but I agree with what Will says. I think it hasn't been so incredibly burdensome. It's just really, understanding, I think, especially the product listing and manufacturer registration requirements. How does that work? And ensuring that any issues with supply chain are addressed, especially when it comes to safety, like what documentation do you have to support the safety of your product, understanding adverse event reporting requirements and the obligations around that. So I think for us, it's been mainly, educational and helping companies understand what are FDA's expectations. And there have been some guidance documents released, including around adverse event reporting and FDA's mandatory recall authority. So, and it's been kind of been rolling out over, I guess, the past couple years. MoCRA was passed in 2022. So I think there's been somewhat of a cadence to it. And so companies have been able to, understand compliance along the way. I think it's been fairly straightforward for the most part. I think there's been some questions around the safety substantiation standard and what type of data would be needed to support that. What would FDA expect? But I think for the most part, it's been, I would say, relatively straightforward in terms of compliance for companies.
Yeah, looking at it from the requirements pre-market versus post-market. Post-market, of course, is adverse event monitoring, recall authority, inspections. How does FDA's approach look post-marketing versus pre-marketing? Is it the same approach? Is there consistency? And what kind of new guidances or enforcement tools are you seeing emerge? Ren, let me pick up with you because you had the last say on that, and then conclude with Will.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still in the early stages of MoCRA implementation, and it's not really been fully implemented yet, right? Like we're still waiting for a fragrance allergen rule, GMPs, things like that. So on the pre-market side, I mean, aside from some of the listing and registration requirements, I mean, I'm not aware of any FDA compliance activities around that. And even on the post-market side, I think it's still, we're still, like I said, in sort of in the early stages of it. So I'm not aware that FDA is actively out there policing compliance with some of these requirements. So I think it's maybe something to look out for in the future. Now that we do have some guidance documents rolling out where we understand what FDA's expectations are, but I think there's there's some questions around, will FDA actually prioritize enforcement of MoCRA? So I think that's an outstanding question, and I'm, with all of the other areas and priorities that FDA has, I'm just not sure that cosmetics is at the top of that list.
Will, same question.
I agree completely with Rend. We just aren't seeing a lot of activity from a compliance and enforcement standpoint with respect to these requirements, as Rend mentioned, not all of which have been fully implemented. Without question, the CGMP rule, depending on its specific contents, will be the biggest driver of regulatory compliance costs and perhaps present the steepest learning curve for industry in a way that should be a lot more pronounced than compliance with the SAE reporting requirements, which are not identical to those that exist for OTC drugs and dietary supplements, but are very similar in their scope and appropriately tailored to this category, such that marketers of consumer packaged good wellness products that fall into each of those categories already have significant familiarity with. And I'll go back to the funding issue, because unless Congress appropriates sufficient resources for the agency to robustly implement and police and compliance with these requirements, they'll be on the books, and they'll be the subject of whatever inspections occur, and they'll certainly have a role to play in deterring non-compliance from those responsible members of industry who prioritize compliance, but absent really strong enforcement against the the minority of the industry who doesn't take compliance as seriously, it's hard to see, what ultimate impact any of this will have on consumers.
Yeah, I don't see any big push to significantly increase the cosmetics budget within the agency. Do you see anything differently?
Not in this political environment where cost cutting, particularly at HHS, has been such a priority of the current administration over the first 13 months or so. I think, it's possible that in response to the changing winds that FDA could make the case for enhanced budgetary resources to implement some of these things, or to get the ball over the line with respect to some of these congressionally mandated action items. But as we sit here today, it seems unlikely that a significant injection of appropriated resources is anywhere close to on the horizon.
Yeah, Rand, you get the final word on this.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see, as Will said, in this environment and the other sort of hefty priorities that FDA has, that funding, that there would be some additional funding to carry out MoCRA implementation, and that there would be funding for enforcement. I just think FDA has a long list, especially on the food side, of things they want to accomplish as part of the MAHA agenda. Yeah, I mean, funding, resources, all of that, a big question mark for that when it comes to cosmetics, especially compared to food.
Right. Well, thanks both for a great discussion. We're going to turn now to our resource link segment, where we provide valuable links that our listeners may want to check out. You can check them out by going to our website, fdawatch.net. While you're there, you can subscribe by putting in your email address and just pressing submit. And as I do repeatedly in these podcasts, I encourage you to do that. In the pharma area, FDA's Rare Disease Innovation Hub released its 2026 strategic agenda. The agency said it's going to focus on strengthening collaboration across FDA centers, improving engagement with external stakeholders, advancing regulatory science for small population products. It emphasizes serving as a centralized point of contact for the rare disease community. What's going on with rare diseases has always been an important element within FDA, making sure that the way that clinical trials are designed provide flexibility for the kinds of diseases that they treat, especially genetic therapies and cell therapies, where you have generally smaller patient populations. So we'll continue. At some point, we may even do a segment on rare diseases because it's such an important area. From devices, from a recent Reuters report, doctors, patients, and internal documents show that as AI has been integrated into medical devices used in operating rooms, there have been a rising number of malfunction reports. There have been reports where AI-assisted systems misled surgeons and resulted in injuries. This is obviously a serious matter. AI is being instituted across the board in medicine. The article highlights concerns from lawsuits and safety experts that rapid adoption of AI in surgery may outpace effective testing, oversight, and regulatory safeguards. I encourage you to read the full piece. It's available through our resource link, fdawatch.net. On the food side, we're continuing to see food recalls. FDA recently announced a Class 2 recall of 6,000 prepackaged M&Ms. My God, when it gets to M&Ms, it's in bad shape. They were found to lack required allergen warnings for milk, soy, and peanuts. The products were distributed under promotional packaging from numerous companies and organizations, sold in 20 states. Our link takes you to FDA's monitoring link for this recall. And finally, in the cosmetics area, Consumer Reports recently reported that many beauty and personal care products contain chemicals that are linked to health concerns, including parabens, formaldehyde, PFAS, and certain coal tar dyes. They've been associated with hormone disruption, cancer risk, and other serious effects. The article says that the U.S. regulation of cosmetic ingredients, which we've just been talking about with our two guests, remains very limited, which I think both our guests would agree with. And Consumer Reports is now highlighting that. Encourage all of you to access that Consumers Report article. You can do so by accessing FDAWatch.net. On that, I want to thank Rend and Will for being such really insightful guests. I'd also like to thank our podcast creator, executive producer, Michael Levin-Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. If you want to be a marketing partner or a sponsor or just comment on the show, you can reach FDA Watch at our email address, info@fdawatch.net. And again, our website is fdawatch.net. If you're inclined to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, it really does make a difference. So as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. See you next time.